The last time I did a presentation, the topic of restorative justice came up, and there's a lot of confusion around what is restorative justice. And so I'm going to try very, very hard to condense it into 5 minutes, and I apologize in advance if I go a little bit over. But really, the question that I think centers around restorative justice is it more than a slap on the wrist? I found this quote earlier this week that I was really struck by. It says, accountability is active and punishment is passive. Oftentimes, a lot of our current justice systems and models of justice is founded on this idea that punishment is the law of the land, that we are constantly trying to provide opportunities to basically punish offenders. And what restorative justice does is create space and create opportunities for accountability. So let's define our terms. Let's actually get a clear idea of what is restorative justice and what is retributive justice. Retributive justice is what our current criminal justice system is based on. It's typically just between offender and victim and is usually only offender focused. It is punishment and payment focused. It's state or systematically organized. Crime is defined as an offense to individuals and also the shared rules that society holds, otherwise known as laws. And all things are made right once the offender pays the society or pays government back for his crimes, and balance is achieved. We often think of justice again in terms of those scales. In retributive justice, the amount of harm suffered by the victim is to be shared by the offender, and equality is only brought about through punishment. Through this system, you need professionals to represent victims victims and offenders in order to fix their problems, and this often takes an exorbitant amount of time and money. And overall, there's usually a lack of communication between victims and offenders. However, in a restorative justice model, it includes offenders, victims, offenders' families, victims' families, members of the local community, and is much more holistically or usually often victim focused. The focus of restorative justice is to bring about rehabilitation, and it is usually organized by the community or collectively. Crime is defined as an offense to the collective and to the shared values of the community and to people. And all things are made right when everybody who is involved in the crime has been heard and understood and relationship restored. Oftentimes it is described as being like a circle. And the reason why it's described as a circle is because restorative justice as a perspective has no beginning or an end. It's a continuous process to mend and fix broken relationships. There's a lot of preparation that's often needed beforehand, and focus can be on the offender, but it's often created in such a way where many voices can be included. And is usually focused on victim restoration. Restorative justice can happen at any point in time, and it can be pervasive within the current criminal justice system. So really, we have to think about restorative justice as a paradigm shift. It looks beyond the offender and the offense / the punishment of the offense, and tries to understand the needs of all the people involved and allowing for communication and healing. It asks the question, what is the underlying issue when it comes to committing crime? And we move from an adversarial model, an us versus them, to an inquisitorial model. So trying to find the underlying issue. What is the truth? Restorative justice is not just concerned with the end result. Restorative justice is concerned about the process. It is an awareness of the assumptions that are occurring right from the very get-go, from the very beginning of this process, and allows for us to experience and become aware of the assumptions and allow ourselves to have our assumptions challenged or changed. The focus is on healing that occurs during the process as a justice model. In other words, it's a power shift. It's a dynamic that forces people in power to surrender any source of power that they have in order to actually listen and humbly receive what is being said, and to search after something that has greater value and priority, which is healing and restoration. I was really struck in having a conversation with the head of the Restorative Justice Unit of the RCMP out in BC, where he said, if all parties, including the offender, believes that the offender needs to die for their crimes, then restorative justice has occurred. Again, the focus is not on the end result. The focus is on the process and on the healing that occurs from listening. Just a really, really quick overview of the history. Restorative justice is rooted in many indigenous models of justice, but also religious, typically Judeo-Christian principles of justice. And really, this kind of made it into its mainstream of criminal justice thinking because criminologists wondered why Indigenous peoples were being so overrepresented in the Canadian justice system and have higher degrees of recidivism, which is to say rates of reoffense. So if the person goes into the system and they come out, why would they reoffend? And typically we see an increase in that among Indigenous peoples. Yes, because of over-policing. Yes, because of all the other issues that come with policing, but also because the system doesn't really understand Indigenous ways of doing justice, which does typically fall under a model of restorative justice. Again, restorative justice has high degrees of accountability from community members to the offender, but it always needs to be a choice rather than forced submission to state rules or laws. Our system, our criminal justice system, and the way that systems typically work is that it is highly individualized. It's Eurocentric and North American viewpoints and values of justice. Crime is a violation of a contract made between the state and individuals versus a collectively oriented Indigenous, Asian, African, Latinx view of justice, where crimes break shared values that's held by communities. A lot of the research has shown it is very difficult. Restorative justice processes are very, very difficult processes and take a huge emotional toll, especially for victims. There's not a lot of research for serious crimes because oftentimes victims and survivors of serious crimes aren't really willing to undergo a restorative justice process. And so right now we've seen that it's been incredibly effective with non-violent or non-serious crimes, but that's just because the vast majority of cases come from those things. Offenders have tried to there have been cases where offenders have tried to undergo a restorative justice process in order to receive a lighter sentence, but that usually leads to disingenuous apologies or feelings of remorse. And you may be asking, well, what's the point? Like, why do we want to change things to begin with? Why bring about this restorative justice model? And it really is because the current model isn't working. Recidivism rates are very, very high, especially among Indigenous peoples. And it's because punishment, for the most part, doesn't work to make people offend less. It doesn't deter people from committing crime if you say, we're going to give you a really, really high punishment. An example of this is if you are texting while driving, for the most part, a really, really, really like stringent or like strict punishment doesn't really deter people from texting and driving. What deters people from texting and driving is to see the emotional impact that it has when you accidentally hurt or even worse, kill someone as a result of texting and driving. This is the thing that restorative justice focuses on. It focuses on the emotional, relational aspects, and that's what deters people from recommitting crimes, recidivating, and recommitting their crimes. I like to think of restorative justice as a way of life. And it asks the question, is our underlying belief that justice is solely about punishment? Typically, our consumption of crime media and news tends to sensationalize and overemphasize criminal behavior. Our outrage at such behaviors creates greater divides between community members and crimes, making restorative justice really, really difficult. So again, we have to ask the question, are we willing to adopt a rehabilitative, forgiveness-based, or restorative model of justice that repairs relationship rather than dehumanize offenders? The space that restorative justice creates is for empathy, compassion, and understanding, both for the offender, but also for us as community members. And this is often played out in things like circle sentencing, which is an investment, involves investment, listening, receiving, and understanding. I've included this Hebrew word, the Shema Israel. If you're familiar with Jewish culture, it's the first words of this famous prayer in Deuteronomy and in the Deuteronomical texts in Jewish culture that says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And it's because the word in Hebrew means like listening. There's no such thing as we hear things and it just sits in our brain and it just disappears. In Hebrew, the word listen means to take it in and do something about it. And that's really what restorative justice allows for. It allows for listening, where we take it in and we do something about it. Thanks for listening.